Thank you. Well, I'd like to talk about the cholesterol controversy. On February 19th of 2015, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee issued a report on what Americans should eat. And it included these words: available evidence shows no appreciable relationship between consumption of dietary cholesterol and serum cholesterol. And so cholesterol is not a nutrient of consumption for over-concern. And instantly the firestorm was ignited. And everybody suddenly realized, hooray! The thing that's most important in our lives is to eat an egg. And we can do that. In fact, not only can we eat an egg, we can eat lots of eggs. And because the population doesn't know the difference between cholesterol in foods and cholesterol in your blood, or between cholesterol in foods and fat in foods, they took this a little bit further. It's not just eggs. We can eat sausage. We can eat everything. And there started to be this idea that cholesterol doesn't matter. In fact, food doesn't matter. The new American idea is, who cares about food? There was just a Gallup poll. Did you see this? It was this month. They surveyed 1,009 adults. And this might be a little hard to see in the back. That green line on the top is how many Americans are avoiding fat. And as you can see in the last year, a big drop. Who cares about avoiding fat? You don't have to do it. But it's not just fat. This is the same thing for salt. We don't have to avoid salt either. So the whole idea is, who cares? Eat whatever you want to. It doesn't have anything to do with your health. Okay, reality check. What is cholesterol? What does it do? What are the issues? Okay, chole, bile. All right, so those cholesterol stones that form in the gallbladder, and here they are. That was really the first form where cholesterol was understood, but cholesterol is an interesting molecule. It has all kinds of functions in the body. In fact, cholesterol is necessary. Dietary cholesterol is not necessary, but your body makes it and uses it for quite a variety of things. Number one, cell membranes. If you were a potted plant, you would get all of your nutrients from the soil and from the atmosphere, and you don't need to move because food comes to you, and all of your cells have a rigid cell wall that keeps you fixed in position. But luckily, we somehow along the line figured out we could pull up our roots and move around. And so we don't have cell walls, we have cell membranes. And what keeps that cell membrane fluid is cholesterol. It's made inside the cell, and those little yellow dots you see sprinkled along in the membrane help maintain the fluidity of that cell membrane. So cholesterol is key to cell membranes. As I mentioned, it's in the membranes of the cells. What that means is cholesterol is mostly in the lean portion of meat. Let me repeat that. If a person has the bad judgment to eat some meat, the cholesterol is mainly in the lean portion. It is not in the fat. Now, fat has problems of its own, but the cholesterol is in the lean, okay? Strip away all the fat and there's still plenty of cholesterol. Okay, secondly, cholesterol is a raw material for building hormones. Here it is. There's those 4 rings, 6 carbon, 6 carbon, 6 carbon, 5 carbon. And then there's the 8 carbon chain off to the side. And cholesterol is an amazing thing. You can take it, and with a couple of little changes, you can make testosterone out of it. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but that's what happens. But with almost the same kind of changes, you can make estradiol. And estrogens are almost identical to testosterone. Just these tiny little changes are the difference between that and that. That's what cholesterol does. Amazing molecule. Cholesterol makes vitamin D. So with sunlight on your skin, the 7-dehydrocholesterol turns into vitamin D3 with a few other steps, as all of you know. So cholesterol has all these functions, but let me add one. It contributes to cardiovascular disease. So I think of cholesterol as really useful, like dynamite is really useful. If you want to make a tunnel, or you want to expand your mind, or whatever, that's really good. And dynamite will help you do those, but it's something you've got to play with very carefully. Cholesterol is just like that. So in the top artery, you see the blood cells moving along very nicely through the vessel. The second line, cholesterol particles have oxidized and irritated the artery wall, causing the formation of an atherosclerotic plaque. And in the third line, well, that plaque is ruptured, you're not getting any blood flow anymore, you're having an infarction. All right, so back 30 years ago or more, it became clear that higher cholesterol levels were associated with heart disease. And this has been nuanced and studied over time, but there really isn't anyone who disputes that cholesterol contributes to cardiovascular risk, except the people who say that people didn't land on the moon and that kind of stuff. But the higher your cholesterol, the higher your risk, and means of lowering it, whether it's pharmacologically or through diet, will reduce your risk. So where does cholesterol come from? It's produced in all animal cells. That's how it gets into the membrane. But the liver is especially keen on making it, and your body makes about 1 gram per day. And then some people will add another 200, 300, 400 milligrams through diet, all of which is unnecessary, because that gram that your body is making is all that you need. Saturated fat that you eat will increase the cholesterol concentration in your blood in about a 1 to 2 ratio. A 1% increase in saturated fat will increase your LDL by about 2%. Okay. All right. So cholesterol from food products. There isn't any requirement for it. You don't need any. You don't need cholesterol supplements. And when you ingest cholesterol, it is absorbed. Roughly, I'm going to say roughly 50% of the cholesterol you eat comes into the body in the early part of the small intestine. And then chylomicrons take that and they run it into the circulatory system. So food has cholesterol that does get into the blood, and really the discussion should end there. If the question is, does cholesterol raise your blood cholesterol? The cholesterol you eat does get into your blood. End of story. All the rest of this lecture is going to be about sort of all the arguments about that and trying to make sense of it. But the food you eat does have cholesterol, gets into your bloodstream. Okay. So the question is, what is the relationship between cholesterol and foods and blood cholesterol levels? And back in the 50s and 60s, Ansel Keys from the University of Minnesota, Mark Hegstead at Harvard, started looking at this question of how does cholesterol you eat affect your blood test? And very early on, they started using this term that it's a curvilinear effect. And what they meant by that is the first bits of cholesterol you're ingesting have a big effect. But after you're ingesting a lot of it, if you have more and more and more, it doesn't have so much of an effect. This curve is from the Food and Nutrition Board at the Institute of Medicine. And what you see is on the left-hand side, that's where you're having a little bit of increase in dietary cholesterol and getting a measurable increase in your blood cholesterol. But once you get out to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 milligrams a day, you're just not seeing much added effect. But those are heroic and completely unrealistic cholesterol intakes. Most people might eat 3, 4, 5, maybe 600 milligrams of cholesterol a day, not really much more than that. And at those lower levels of intake, it's really linear. In other words, the more cholesterol you eat, the higher your blood cholesterol. And so this is the same graph, but just looking at more modest levels of cholesterol intake. Okay? So Mark Hegstead made this equation where X is the dietary cholesterol change per 1,000 calories. And Y is the change in your blood. And he found this factor that will explain the difference. And I'm going to simplify that. It's really the amount of cholesterol you eat, take about 1/10 of it, that's what's going to happen in your blood, in milligrams per deciliter. So to give you an example of how this would work, let's take an egg. An average egg would have roughly 200 milligrams of cholesterol in it, some more, some less, depending on the type. And I'm going to assume, say, a 2,000 calorie diet, just to make it simple. So that's 100 milligrams of cholesterol per 1,000 calories. You multiply it by 0.1, and you get about a 10 milligram per deciliter increase in your blood cholesterol. Is that true? If I eat an egg, will my cholesterol go up that much? Well, let's look at some data. This is Frank Sack's study from Harvard years ago. He brought in a group of people who were remarkable because they were ovo-lacto-vegetarians. They weren't eating meat at all. And at baseline, their egg consumption was average about 3 eggs per week. That was it. And adding 1 extra large egg per day for 3 weeks increased their blood cholesterol by about not quite 12 points. LDL got worse as well. HDL went down, and their triglycerides went up. Okay, so that roughly is in line with the model that Hegstead stated. You do see this definite increase. This was Bill Connor's work in Portland. He brought in a group of people, and over a 4-week period, gave them eggs, about, if I'm remembering correctly, it was about 500 milligrams of cholesterol a day in a couple of eggs. And an egg substitute was used in a control group. And as you can see, the egg group's cholesterol went up, the substitute group went down. Then he crossed them over to the opposite condition. And so the egg eaters started eating egg substitute, and the egg substitute eaters started eating eggs, and exactly what you'd expect happened, which is their cholesterols went up if they were eating eggs, okay? So a number of meta-analyses have been done to try to pull the data together and to make sense of things. And this was done by Hopkins in 1992, and he did a very interesting thing. And he showed that top, you see that top curve? That's people who aren't eating any cholesterol at all to start. And for them, if you add cholesterol to the diet, you see this huge increase in their blood cholesterol. But then the other lines are people eating more and more and more cholesterol before the experiment starts. So the bottom line could be somebody who's having steak dinners and sausage for breakfast. That person, you add more cholesterol to their diet, you may not see much of anything, okay? So the amount of cholesterol you start with determines the effect of adding more. And I am going to argue that cigarettes are totally safe. If you give just a modest cigarette serving to a person smoking 4 packs a day, I don't think you could show any result. But on the other hand, if you take a non-smoker and you have them smoking even a little bit on an everyday basis, you're going to see a problem. You see what I mean? So, all right. So in 1997, Howell did a meta-analysis, large group, and what he predicted, based on, you just crunch everybody together, the vegans, the ovo-lactos, and the heavy meat eaters, and you try to see what you find. And his suggestion was, if you knock about 100 milligrams of cholesterol out of your diet, that's maybe a half an egg, that the average cholesterol level would drop a little more than 2 points, okay? For an individual, that might not mean much, but population-wide, that would have an effect. Similar result, this is Clark, same year, 1997. He showed that if you're cutting 200 milligrams of cholesterol out of your diet, your total cholesterol will fall about 5 points, and your LDL about 4 points. Good, okay? By about this point, it was becoming very well accepted that cholesterol you eat is an issue. 2001, a meta-analysis, 17 studies, and same kind of result. 100 milligrams of cholesterol will raise your total cholesterol 2 points and make your ratio worse. Okay, so the ratio of total to HDL, not getting better, it's getting worse. All right. So the Institute of Medicine summarized all this, and they said it's true that if you bump your dietary cholesterol up, you can expect about a 2-point increase for every 100 milligrams of dietary cholesterol. So my conclusion is that dietary cholesterol does go into the blood, about roughly half of it. The increase is greatest at the lowest levels of baseline intake. And from a public health standpoint, it's significant, meaning even a few percentage points on cholesterol, which might not mean much to you or me as individuals, if the whole population has a 2, 5, 10-point rise in cholesterol, the bodies are going to start to add up, okay? There are compensatory mechanisms where your liver will make less, but they're not able to solve the problem, okay? So, how did the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee come up with this idea that available evidence shows no relationship? Well, they said it's consistent with the conclusions of a report. In this case, they were relying on a report by the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology. And if you look at that report, it never actually said that. First of all, it was limited to evidence published after 1998. which all the meta-analyses that I showed you, except for one, were done before that, and they ignored all the meta-analyses. They intentionally didn't look at them. They said that we need additional research, especially on lower levels of cholesterol intake, but they never said that dietary cholesterol has no appreciable effect. Those just weren't their words. So we looked into this a little bit. Why would the dietary guidelines for Americans, which are intended to set policy for every American, and relying on this report, where did they come up with this? Well, the short answer is I don't know. But one of the members of the committee was Alice Lichtenstein, who's a terrific researcher and very influential. But she was on the committee and also on one of the writers of the report. And the same year as that report came out, she and Griffin published their own review on this, and I wanted to share with you their findings. They said, based on 12 studies, that the effect on plasma lipid concentrations, the effect that cholesterol has on plasma lipids, is modest and appears to be limited to certain population subgroups, so kind of downplaying it. So I want to take her 12 trials, and you can't read this part, but here are all 12 trials. And then I put the funding sources in there, and I apologize, this is so tiny. Of 12 trials, 11 are industry funded, 10 are eggs, and 1 is fish. The fish one was studying whether prawns affect cholesterol levels. So then they're looking at the population. And now, some of the results were not statistically significant, and some were. So I'm just lumping them together. If your cholesterol went up even a hair, I'm calling that unfavorable. If it went down even a tiniest bit, I'm calling that favorable. So I put U for all the ones where it was unfavorable and F for all the ones where it was favorable. You see a pattern. What this reminds me of is back when I was a medical resident, I got a call from the dean of students at the medical school at GW. He said, Dr. Barnard, did you prescribe a narcotic painkiller for a medical student last week? And I said, yes, I did. He came to me, he had a serious painful condition, and he just needed 1 dose before he could fill his prescription the next day, and I wrote him a painkiller, a prescription. And he said, you probably weren't aware that that same student had approached 23 other doctors, and they all gave him prescriptions. The point I'm making is if you're a researcher doing a study, and you might be funded by the egg board or whatever, and you think you're doing good work, and you see just a couple of point rise in cholesterol, and it's not statistically significant, who cares? But what you discover is there are researchers all over the country and all over the world finding that same little bump up that with one alone might not matter very much. Are you with me? Is this making sense? Okay. So most current research on dietary cholesterol is industry-driven. Back in 2001, there was a review of 17 studies, and of them, 7 were industry-funded. But 10 years later, you look at it, this is Griffin's, and it's now 92%. Why? Because back around 2000, everybody accepted that dietary cholesterol raises blood cholesterol. It's just a fact. The only people who are doing research now, really, are people who are trying to disprove it. And so that's industry, all right? So if I wanted to do a study and I wanted to make cholesterol look good, I can do it. You use a small participant sample so that even if you get results showing it goes up, it's not significant. And some of them, you'll see a rise of 15, 16 points from eating a couple of eggs, and you can say it's not significant because in my 12 research participants, it could have been chance. Start with a high cholesterol diet. Do not bring vegans into your study. And all the studies I showed you, that's basically where they are. Compare it to sausage. If you're a comparator group, I'm not making this up, you can show that eating cholesterol is no worse than eating sausage and cheese. Some of the studies have done an interesting thing, which is to separate hyper and hypo responders. And this is legitimate. There are people who respond more to cholesterol than others. And so some of these studies have said, okay, well, if we just take out the hypo responders, then you can show for them cholesterol that they didn't have any effect at all. But what they don't do is test those people over and over and over again to see if this is really just some trait that they carry with them. And there are genes that affect this, but in virtually all the genetic groups, we've seen at least a mild cholesterol elevation in response to cholesterol that you eat, okay? Some people will say that a small rise in cholesterol doesn't matter. I think that is true for an individual. I think that is not true for a population. And finally, this claim that eggs don't contribute to heart attacks. There is something to this. I'm going to talk about this more in a minute. But some people will say, I don't care if it raises your cholesterol. If you can't show that eggs directly cause heart attacks, we don't care. That, to me, is a risky argument. I'll get back to that. Finally, in reviews, it's been fashionable in some of the studies to say we're going to disregard all evidence prior to recent years. And in recent years, all the studies are industry funded. So it's creating a scientific problem. Okay, so back to this question of can you cause a heart attack? I'm going to argue that that pat of butter is perfectly safe. What do I mean? I mean that it's got 2.5 grams of saturated fat. It's even got some trans fats, and it's got cholesterol in it. But you can't show me a study that has teased out just a pat of butter. What they'll do is they'll look at all dairy fats and look at it as a group, and it all kinds of adds up to a problem. But people haven't really studied just that pat of butter to see if it's a problem. By the way, I'm not saying that it really isn't a problem. What I'm saying is nobody can realistically study it. 2 strips of bacon, same story. They've clearly got saturated fat, a little bit of trans fats, and even some cholesterol. But nobody's doing a study of just 2 strips of bacon. So the bacon industry can say, see, there's no evidence that it's a harm. The reality is, though, it all adds up. When your city is being flooded, how much of it is from the rain, how much of it is from the river, how much of it is from the stream, how much of it is backwash from the sewers, the saturated fat and cholesterol in butter and bacon and eggs and all of these things all add up, and any effort to exonerate part of it is kind of deviating from science. So that's where we were as of a month ago. And then the current issue of the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition just came out with a new meta-analysis. This was funded by the egg industry, but what they found was that if you increase dietary cholesterol, it does increase your blood cholesterol level. And this was just the result of all the different studies and putting them all together. When that came out, it was accompanied by an editorial that was written by a terrific researcher and clinician, Robert Eckel in Colorado. And he had been the lead author on the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology report earlier. And he said, okay, despite the fact he had earlier kind of downplayed this, the last paragraph of his commentary says, all right, if you're ordering an omelet, why not order the egg white omelet? Now, he said a few other things that I might not say, like lean meat and so forth. But the point was, maybe it has been true all this time, that the prudent thing is not to eat cholesterol and not to eat those egg yolks. When you get into this discussion, if you have the time, let me encourage you to read the fine print. You will see studies about this, and it's always good, if you ever have the ability, to look through it. In Eckel's commentary, he cited an interesting study by Schoenfeld, which is a very good study, going back to 1982. And he brought in 20 men, and he tested 3 eggs versus 6 eggs. But he did it by looking at the baseline diets that people were consuming. What was their PS ratio? How much polyunsaturated fat did they eat? How much saturated fat did they eat? To see if a high saturated fat diet would lead to a higher elevation from cholesterol that you add. Maybe you're eating more oil, maybe you have more protection. Okay, so here's the way Eckel said it. He said if you have a PS ratio of 0.25 to 0.4, that means you're really not getting a lot of polyunsaturated fat. You're getting a lot of bacon grease. Okay? In that, 3 eggs increased LDL by 16%, and 6 eggs increased it by 25 points. Huge. I'm sorry, 16 milligrams per deciliter, or 25 if it was 6 eggs. Major increase. Then, if your PS ratio is a little higher, less saturated fat, more polyunsaturated fat, Eckel said, well, only 6 eggs is going to do this by a good margin, 16 milligrams per deciliter, but he omitted the fact that 3 eggs would increase LDL by 9 points because that was not statistically significant. Then if your ratio is 2.5, meaning a lot of oil, not much animal fat, according to Eckel, neither amount of cholesterol intake produced a significant change. But if you actually read the study, 3 eggs increased LDL by 6 points, and 6 eggs increased by 10 points. But again, it's not significant, not statistically significant, okay? So let me pull up the study. Here's 1982. That top line there, that's the people with the large amount of animal fat, and then when you add start adding cholesterol into their diet, which you're doing after the bottom, the graph starts, they're on a run-in diet, then their cholesterol's at the bottom. Then you start adding the eggs after the second dot, and as you can see, all the lines go up, okay, up to 3 eggs, 6 eggs. Everybody's cholesterol rises in all these groups, all right? So the point being, if you have a small increase, you can say, well, it could have been chance alone. But if every single person is finding the same thing, you really can't call it chance. So does it matter? Does it really matter? Well, yeah, it does in the sense that cholesterol will increase your blood cholesterol. But what might be more important is that cholesterol-containing foods also have saturated fat. So 2 eggs, they have about 362 milligrams of cholesterol, but they also have a good 3 grams of saturated fat. Now, eggs are rather small, but that's about 19% of calories is saturated fat. And if I'm trying to keep my saturated fat down to, some people would say 10%, I would say a lot lower than that, eggs aren't helping you. They're pushing it in the wrong direction. And this pie graph shows you the sources of cholesterol in the diet. The big blue one is eggs, followed by chicken, beef, and cheese. And let's just take those 4. They all have a fair amount of cholesterol. They're animal products. But they all have saturated fat, varying amounts. So the saturated fat goes with the cholesterol. Now let's look at some plant products. Oh, by the way, Chinook salmon, not cholesterol-free and not fat-free. Cheddar cheese is an embarrassingly large amount of saturated fat, as you know. But let's look at plant products. And what you see, just a dramatically different situation. No cholesterol, and look at the saturated fat, 0.1, 0.2, 0.04. So that is a low saturated fat intake. Cholesterol and saturated fat go together. So what about eggs? I think it's been a very legitimate and fruitful discussion about them, and I don't think the last word has been written, but let me share some perspective on it. There was a meta-analysis published in 2013 by Lee and Associates, and it showed that eggs would increase the risk of developing diabetes. And in the same year, there was another meta-analysis by Shen, same deal. In fact, they quantified it, about a 42% increase in risk. So what about cardiovascular disease? In Lee's study, he said, yep, if you're eating eggs, your risk of cardiovascular disease will rise. In Shen's study, they said, no. You see it only in people who have diabetes. And in this case, you saw quite a substantially increased risk of cardiovascular complications among egg eaters who also had diabetes. Well, why do you see one result in one study and another result in another study? I don't know the answer, but Shin said, well, take this with a grain of salt, because the populations we looked at were mostly people eating a high baseline fat cholesterol diet. And they felt that it might be harder to tease out the issues there. In other words, if you want to say that eggs don't contribute to cardiovascular disease, it's a challenging argument to make. So what I think might be most important is if we are going to make recommendations for broad groups of people, you want to think about who that would be. In the United States, if you take people with diabetes who are at particular risk and add the people who have pre-diabetes, that's 115 million Americans. That's a third of people. You're also talking about children. And if you think about your 7-year-old daughter, how much cholesterol do you want in her diet? And what blood cholesterol do you want her to have? The idea, obviously, is that you want it to be the best. And then low literacy individuals, which I'm going to say is every American. By that I mean, if we are talking about biochemistry, to say you could choose the food that has elevated cholesterol content but not so much in the saturated fat and choose those foods appropriately, you are asking people to do something that is impossible for almost everybody, which is why this nihilism has really taken over. I guess cholesterol really doesn't matter. It's very risky. So what is the answer? We all know this. We've been studying this for years, and we know the answer is Lipitor. Lipitor and all the statins are highly effective for reducing blood cholesterol. They will do it, and your patients are going to benefit from it, and but they also have some side effects. Muscle pain, liver damage, diabetes risk, and it will increase your blood glucose and cause you to gain a little bit of weight. Now, I don't mean to say that that statins should not be used. What I mean to say is that they're not entirely safe for everybody. The glycemic control literature is new and interesting. Let me just share this with you. This was done at Weill Cornell. They looked at 9 prior studies, fairly big group, about 10,000 people, and 3.5-year follow-up, and they showed among people with diabetes, if you're on a statin, your A1C is about 1/10 higher. Now that's not a lot for any individual because it'll bounce around. But if all of your people with diabetes suddenly have 1/10 up on their A1C, that's not so good. And this is that same meta-analysis. Most of the studies just push your A1C just a little bit out to the right. This will not be on the test. Okay. And one of the more interesting side effects of statins comes from Dwayne Gravelin. He's a physician. He was a NASA astronaut in training. And many of you know Dwayne's story because he's written about it quite extensively. He got home from work, drove home from NASA, goes to his house, and there's this woman outside his door. And he says, "Can I help you?" She looked at him and said, "Dwayne, I'm your wife." She puts him in the car. They drive to the emergency room, and she says, "My husband has lost his memory. What's the matter?" And he starts to put 2 and 2 together, and he's got all these memory gaps, including who his wife was. And the only thing that they could figure is he had started Lipitor about 4 weeks before. And they thought that couldn't be it. It's a safe drug. But they stopped it, and his memory gradually returned, as did his hypercholesterolemia. So he started the Lipitor again at half the dose, and within about a month, his memory was totally wiped out for everything after age 13. So the Lipitor was then in the trash, his memory came back, and he wrote to the FDA. And he said, "I'm an N of 1, but this was not good." And initially these reports were poo-pooed, but there have now been hundreds and hundreds of case reports of individuals having severe memory problems, including individuals in nursing homes diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease that went away when they stopped the statin drug. They packed their bags and went home. Now, so the point I'm making is that you see all these problems. But put this in context. I am not saying that these problems are frequent. I'm not saying that they outweigh the benefit of statins. I don't mean to say that at all, and I don't mean to say that there isn't a role for statins. What I do mean to say is most people taking statins do not need them, in my view. They are using them to treat the sausage and egg breakfast, the bologna sandwich lunch, the pepperoni pizza dinner. And if you take those same people, there are other approaches that we could use. This was a paper that we published a number of years ago, a systematic review, where we're looking at plant-based diets on individuals with high cholesterol. The green marks are total cholesterol. And if you're to the left of that line, that means your total cholesterol fell on a plant-based diet. And the brown line is LDL and the blue line is HDL. And as you can see, they all fall. LDL and total cholesterol fall in every single study of hypercholesterolemic individuals. Now we're looking at people who start with a normal cholesterol level, and you see pretty much the same finding. You see a bigger drop in HDL here, but the ratio seems to be preserved pretty well. Okay? So the bottom line is that a plant-based diet will do this for you. David Jenkins, who many of you know, is a real genius at the University of Toronto, said, well, okay, why be modest? Let's see what else we can do. Let's take people on a vegan diet, add soluble fiber, soy proteins, almonds, and sterol or stanol margarines, and let's see just how powerful this effect can be. He called this the portfolio diet, and what he found was that inside of 4 weeks, LDL fell by 29%, and you compare that to a statin, the results are kind of in the same ballpark in very, very, very quick results, okay? Now, there are side effects. Just as any drug has side effects, so does a plant-based diet. It will reduce body weight. The 0 line there is on the extreme right because every single study that we've been able to find shows that plant-based diets cause weight loss. We published this last year in JAND. It will improve your A1C. If people have diabetes, what you see is that their A1Cs improve. It will reduce blood pressure. This is systolic in observational studies, but now these are the controlled trials. The top is systolic and the bottom is diastolic, and you can see a pretty clear trend. And I think this is what Dr. Mackinnon was talking about, that your cholesterol will fall, your blood pressure will come down, your weight will come down, your blood sugar comes down. That is a heck of a drug, if we could do this, okay? In the time I have remaining, I'd like to just make a few comments about saturated fat. For those of you who were discouraged last year to see this wonderful Time magazine article that said, I guess you don't have to worry about saturated fat. And Mark Bittman, who's a great guy at the New York Times, said, well, butter is back. And when you're looking for some pork for your stew, you can have the fattiest ones. What were they talking about? A meta-analysis had come out saying that saturated fat isn't going to hurt your heart. And skipping this, here's the meta-analysis. I just want to walk you through this for just a second, if you'll just bear with me. If you're to the right of that curve, that means the right of that zero line, that means saturated fat is risky. It increases the risk of coronary disease. If you're to the left of that line, that means saturated fat is safe, reduces the risk. And it's pretty hard to make much sense of that. You see things all over the map. But this is a mixture of, that's the Oxford vegetarian study. There's the Malmo study. In the Oxford vegetarian study, they included people who had quite a range of baseline saturated fat intakes. And what you showed is that the people who had a high saturated fat intake tended to get coronary disease. The people who had a low intake tended not to. Malmo was in Sweden, and they did not have a very dramatic range of saturated fat intake. And it was really pretty hard to see an effective diet, and that's the way it is. It's the same thing as my smoking analogy. You can show that smoking is totally safe if you don't include any non-smokers in your study. What you are then looking at is what is it that separates the 1 in 10 lifetime smokers who gets lung cancer from the other 9 in 10 who don't. These are real numbers. It might be genetics, it might be something else, but you can't indict tobacco until you have a group that's not exposed to it, okay? The other thing about meta-analysis, we do them, I respect them. They're challenging but important. However, they are very, very democratic. We allow any study into your meta-analysis, good ones, bad ones. And I just completed a meta-analysis on the shape of the Earth. Most studies suggest it's round. However, I did find one or two that suggested it's flat, and according to my meta-analysis, the Earth is kind of football-shaped, really. I then followed it up with another meta-analysis on where Barack Obama was born, and almost all of the studies show that he was born in Hawaii, but I did find a couple that said he was born in Kenya. So according to my meta-analysis, he was born in Baja California. The point I make, I don't mean to belittle meta-analyses, but what I mean to say is it's easy to show things. Things just won't show up in a meta-analysis that will show up in a single, big, very well-conducted study. And when you start letting anybody study, and it can manipulate it. So if something did not show up in a meta-analysis, you don't want to necessarily rule it out. Okay, my conclusions. Dietary cholesterol does add to plasma cholesterol. And as I said earlier, I think you would be right in saying that the average American eating a lot of saturated fat and cholesterol is not going to see much difference from small increases here or there. But on the other hand, making a population-wide guidance suggesting that it doesn't really matter too much is really likely to increase cardiovascular risk for some people because, number one, small elevations in large groups of people can be risky. And secondly, we've promoted, unfortunately, a rather nihilistic notion about nutrition. So I come back to our kids, and I keep thinking, how much cholesterol and animal fat do you really want in their diets? And this comes down to our understanding of science, but also, are we erring on what's sort of okay for somebody we don't care about, or something that's as good as we can possibly prescribe for people that we really do care about? And with that, let me stop. Thank you very much.